Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It's time to turn off the lights and turn on the dark.
Chilling tales for dark nights.
Good evening, listeners, and welcome to another bone-chilling edition of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. I'm your host, Steve Taylor, and tonight marks the grand finale, the fifth and final installment in our special Evil Idol Resurrection series. For the past several weeks, we've been digging into unforgettable performances from our Evil Idol voice acting competitions of years past, shining a spotlight on tales that left lasting scars on the imagination. And tonight, we close things out with two especially dark gems. Both come from our fifth annual competition in 2020. Now, 2020 was a strange year for all of us. It was right in the thick of the pandemic. And Evil Idol, like so much else, was delayed and eventually canceled mid-competition. No one ever officially advanced to round two, but that doesn't mean the performances from round one weren't extraordinary. And tonight, you'll hear two of the best. And remember, Evil Idol is back in full force right now for 2025. Round one is underway and round two begins this November. If you haven't already, make sure you're subscribed to our YouTube channel with notifications enabled so you can watch, vote, and help us decide who will rise to victory and who will fall. While you're there, check out our complete Evil Idol archives from 2016 through 2020, available exclusively on YouTube. Relive every eerie audition, every unforgettable performance, and prepare yourself for the next great voice of horror. And don't forget, you can also follow us wherever you get your podcasts, including Spotify. And if you enjoy what we do, drop us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. Every review helps us bring the chills to more listeners like you. If you'd like even more, including ad-free episodes, early access to new content, and exclusive stories not available anywhere else, head over to chillingtalesfordarknights.com. Memberships start at just $7.99 a month, with savings if you choose an annual plan. Finally, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok to keep up with all the latest frights and behind-the-scenes peeks. So without further ado, it's time to get spooky. Turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Our first tale tonight comes from writer Sam Haysom, and it's performed by Kristen Martin. This was one of the standout entries from Evil Idol 2020's opening round, and Kristen's performance was chillingly vivid. Her pacing sharp, her voice carrying menace and mystery with every word. It's a story about bedtime tales that cut too close to the bone, about a grandmother whose fairy tales may conceal a much darker truth. What begins as a request for a not-so-scary story turns into a memory stitched together with curses and blood. Without further ado, I present to you The Witch by Sam Haysom, performed by Kristen Martin.
Why would you tell a 5-year-old kid such a fucked up tale? Ever since the memory of my 5th birthday came back to me, this is the question I've kept asking myself. But I don't have the answer. I suppose I shouldn't be that surprised. given the other stories my grandma told me when I was little. The one about Mr. Longfingers, for instance. And the secret of the special knock. I really shouldn't be surprised at all. What follows is a memory from the day I turned 5. Because it's taken weeks of therapy for me to unlock it.
Grandma? Will you tell me a story before bed?
She was halfway to the bedroom door when my words stopped her. I didn't want her to go. Grandma had just tucked me in and turned off my bedside lamp, and I suddenly felt afraid. Partly, it was the darkness of my bedroom. The shadows were so thick, I could barely make out my stuffed toys sitting in a row on top of my dresser. But mainly, it was my new birthday present. The present Grandma had got me. It wasn't my main present. That was the pack of Monsters in My Pocket toys I'd ripped open downstairs. This was an extra present. A secret present. I hated it. Even in the dark, I could see its shadowy outline on my table. It gave me the creeps. A story? Well, what kind of story would you like to hear? It was a silly question because Grandma only ever told me one type of story. The scary kind. But because I was already a bit freaked out, I said something I wouldn't normally have done.
Nothing too scary, Grandma.
Grandma raised her eyebrows at me. Not too scary? I shook my head. She leaned over and switched my bedside light back on, then perched at the foot of my bed, smiled down at me. Out of the corner of my eye, I could still see Grandma's present. It was watching me from my bedside table. I did my best to ignore it. Okay, said Grandma, making herself comfortable. I think I'll tell you a story about a witch. Once upon a time, Grandma began, there was a young woman who lived in a cottage by the sea. She didn't have a care in the world. She went to school and she painted, and she read adventure books by the fire in the evening. This girl lived with her mother and her grandmother, and they were all very close. She loved her family very much. One day in the early summer, the girl was coming home from school when she met a boy on the path. She'd never spoken to him before, but she recognized him well enough. He wore the same uniform she did, after all, and she guessed he must be in the year above her at school.
Where are you off to?
Said the boy. His shirt was untucked, and he was smoking a cigarette. The girl hesitated. Her mother had told her cigarettes were bad. She'd also told her never to speak to strangers on her way home from school. But then again, thought the girl, was this boy actually a stranger? The headmaster at their school said they were all one big family. If this boy wore the same uniform as her, they couldn't really be strangers, could they?
I'm going home, answered the girl. My house is along this path.
The boy finished his cigarette, then flicked it into the grass. He smiled at the girl.
And before you go home, don't you want to see something cool?
He asked. The girl was curious, but she also knew she couldn't be late. Her mother would worry terribly if she was late. So she thanked the boy and told him she had to be on her way. But just as she walked past him, he called out to her again.
It's a puppy,
said the boy.
Our dog had a litter of puppies last week, and Dad said I could keep one. It's in this old barn near my house. Don't you want to see the puppy?
Now the girl loved puppies. She'd wanted a dog for as long as she could remember, but her mother always said they couldn't afford one. Right then, she'd have given anything in the world to pet a cute little puppy. When she closed her eyes, she could just picture it. A happy little dog with a big pink tongue and a wagging tail, eager to meet her. The girl paused and looked down the path that led back to her house. She thought about her mother. Then she looked back at the boy who was smiling at her. Was there really any harm, thought the girl, in taking a quick look? So the girl followed the boy, and he led her over a stile and across a big field. And they kept going and going until the girl saw a large barn towering in the distance. and she was so excited that she walked as fast as she could, and the boy laughed and walked right along with her. The girl only started to feel nervous when they were right outside the barn. It had taken longer to get there than she thought it would, and the sun was a lot lower in the sky now. She was going to be late getting home. Her mother would be worried. She wanted to see the puppy quickly so she could hurry back. But the barn was dark and full of shadows, and she couldn't see any sign of it inside. "It's just over there at the back," whispered the boy, as he took her hand and led her into the shadows.
He's going to be so excited to see you.
So the girl took his hand and followed him. And even though his palm was sweaty, she held onto it tight, because she was suddenly starting to feel afraid. It was only when she heard footsteps and laughter behind her, and turned to see two bigger boys emerging from the barn shadows, that the fear inside her turned to terror. When the girl finally got back home, the sun was setting over the ocean, and the sea was the color of blood. The little girl made it through the door of the little cottage before she collapsed in a heap in the hallway, crying her eyes out. It was her grandmother who found her like that. Now, the girl's grandmother was very old and very wise. Mother used to tell her that grandmother had lived so long that she knew all the world's secrets. When she was little, the girl had been frightened of her grandmother, but now the old lady took the young woman in her arms, and she comforted her, told the girl her mother was working late, and she wouldn't be home for a while, told the girl she could tell her anything she wanted. And in the hallway of their little cottage, the girl did. She told her grandmother about the boy, and the barn, and all the terrible things those bigger boys had done to her in the shadows. And her grandmother listened, and she grew very silent and very still. "Come with me," she said. The girl had hardly ever been in her grandmother's room before. When she was little, it always gave her the creeps. Her grandmother had lots of old, scary paintings on the walls, and strange little statues and carvings on her shelves. But right then, as her grandmother led her to an old wooden chair and sat her down, the girl hardly even noticed them. Her grandmother was speaking to her in a soothing voice, and all she could do was listen. She listened as her grandmother told her that there was a special trick she knew, a trick to protect against evil, a trick to protect her against those horrible boys, so that they'd never be able to hurt her again, so that she'd have control of them. As grandmother spoke, she fetched an old wooden box from the bottom of her wardrobe and unlocked it. Inside the box were countless knitted dolls. All of the dolls were the same blank cream color, with no facial features at all, save for the eyes. Every single doll had a pair of eyes that seemed to follow the girl. As grandmother pulled 3 dolls out of the box, she closed her own eyes, began to whisper. The sound made the girl's skin itch, but it didn't last long. Soon her grandmother had lined the dolls up on the carpet and her eyes were open again. The last thing she pulled from the box were a pair of black knitting needles and some yarn. "Those boys that hurt you, sweetheart," she whispered. "I want you to describe them to me." And although she was still terrified, and although it made her feel sick, the girl did. She described the boys as well as she could remember. She described them as her grandmother went to work with her needles. And finally, with the blood-red sun disappearing below the sea outside the cottage window, the dolls were finished. The girl's grandmother took the girl by the hands and looked into her eyes. "I want you to keep hold of these dolls, sweetheart," she whispered. "As long as you have possession of them, those boys will never be able to hurt you again." And you know what? Those boys never did. The girl was sitting in an armchair overlooking the sea when her grandmother burst through the door of the cottage. It was 2 days after they'd made the dolls, and for the first time since she'd met the boy on the pathway, the girl was feeling calm again. As the girl turned from the window and smiled in greeting, the old woman held a newspaper out to the girl with shaking hands.
3 brothers tortured and killed in brutal mass slaying,
read the headline.
Agatha,
whispered her grandmother.
Oh, Agatha, what did you do?
But the girl just kept smiling. She kept smiling as she took her grandmother by the hand and led her upstairs to her bedroom. She kept smiling as she opened her little cupboard and pulled out a cardboard box. And when the old lady cried out in shock and horror as she saw the 3 dolls inside, the girl kept smiling still.
What did you do, Agatha?
whispered her grandmother again. But it was pretty obvious what the girl had done. Each of the dolls had been impaled with at least a dozen sewing pins, all of which had been pushed through their knitted heads. The area below each of their waists had been burned black with a flame. The girl smiled down at her work and took her grandmother's shaking hands in her own.
They won't be hurting anyone now, will they?
She whispered.
You see, sweetheart,
said Grandma as she stood up from my bed and switched off the light.
I gave you one with a happy ending.
I lay in the dark, feeling sick. I don't think I'd understood everything Grandma had told me. Not right then, at least. But I'd understood enough. I'd understood enough to know I felt worse now than I had before the story started.
Grandma, wait,
I said, my voice stopping her mid-turn.
Isn't your name Agatha?
Grandma looked back at me and smiled. She walked over and leaned down, kissing me on my forehead. Time to get some sleep, Chris, she whispered. And remember, that present I got for you is always there, if you ever need it. She stood up and left my bedroom. I stared after her, but a few moments later, my eyes were pulled back to the gift on my bedside table. The knitted doll. It gazed right back at me, its face featureless, save for 2 blank, staring eyes.
You've just heard The Witch, written by Sam Haysom and performed by Kristen Martin. A haunting meditation on family ties and a legacy of darkness passed from one generation to the next. Through Kristen's voice, the bedtime story became something far more sinister, an inheritance no child should ever receive. This was just one of the extraordinary performances that came out of Evil Idol 2020, the competition that never got to finish. A year cut short, but a year that still gave us remarkable work like this. If you enjoyed it, don't forget, every Evil Idol season from 2016 to 2020 is waiting for you right now on our YouTube channel. And of course, Evil Idol 2025 is happening as we speak, with round 2 beginning this November. Head to YouTube, watch the entries, and cast your vote to help crown the next great voice of horror. Our second feature tonight is no less disturbing. It comes from writer Andy Leavy, and it's performed by Mylo Reid. This too was a round 1 highlight of the 2020 competition, and Mylo's performance captured both desperation and dread, pulling listeners deep into the nightmare. This one's about love, and the terrible lengths we'll go in order to save the ones we hold dear. When modern medicine fails, a desperate cure is sought, but the price is unholy, and the hunger it awakens can never be satisfied. Without further ado, I present to you My Girlfriend is a Cannibal by Andy Leavy, performed by Mylo Reid.
A horrible curse befell my girlfriend, and now she can only eat human meat, and I'm her personal butcher. It all started 2 years ago, when my girlfriend became very ill and struggled to eat. Anything she did eat would usually come back up a few minutes later. At first, the doctors weren't sure what was wrong with her, theorizing it may be a stomach ulcer. But after her health continued to deteriorate, further tests revealed that she wasn't suffering from stomach ulcers, but instead, stomach cancer. This news shattered our world. Never in a million years could we have guessed it would be cancer. Elaine was in her mid-20s, and I know that doesn't make you immune, but it sure makes you feel that way. The cancer was caught pretty late, and neither of us had a lot of money, essentially living paycheck to paycheck, so our medical options weren't great. We live in Buffalo, meaning we were just 30 minutes too far south for good and affordable medical care. And with Elaine unable to work, I made the choice to take on a second job as a nightly garbage collector. Didn't pay great, but beggars can't be choosers. It was at this job, however, that I met Eli Carson. Eli was a wild dude. He was only 30, but looked easily as if he was in his mid-40s, and had a shaved head with a singular rat's tail hanging out the back. His eyes were dark green, and his face had a long, thick scar going from his right eyebrow, down across the bridge of his nose, right down to his left cheek. The craziest thing about him, though, is that he grew up in a cult, a sort of offshoot of the unification movement cult set up by the more eccentric members. He told me he'd been a member from birth, and lived in a commune until he was 19, at which point he escaped. The stories he had from the cult made the night shift go by much quicker, but it was once I told him about Elaine's situation that the funny stories turned serious. Due to his cult links, Eli knew some pretty weird and out there people, and he put me on to someone who he said could cure Elaine 100%. Her name was Madame Arachnia. Eli described her as the craziest mix of genius and psycho he'd ever met. He said that she worshipped eldritch gods, and that she believed H.P. Lovecraft was not a fiction writer, but instead a prophet. However, he promised me that no matter how insane her beliefs were, that nobody else was better equipped to help. I got shot one night while out on a date, and I was set to be on crutches for 6 months, but she had me walking in no time, he insisted, though I doubted the veracity of the claim. Elaine was quickly running out of options, however, and I couldn't live with myself if we didn't try everything we could. So what if it turned out to be a hoax? It wouldn't change anything about our current situation. Madame Arachnia worked out of a camp deep in a forest at Niagara Gorge. The camp was designed to look like a circus, including a big top tent. Fairy lights hung up all over the camp, connecting the multiple tents and teepees that were dispersed throughout. Up in the left corner, just beside the big top, was an animal pen that contained some sheep, goats, cows, and horses. Madame Arachnia's tent was situated at the back of the camp and guarded by 2 tall men dressed like jesters. However, instead of the usual colorful attire, they wore all black. They wore skull masks and vests made of bones, as well as coal-black jesters' hats with little skull bells that jingled as they walked. Both men carried 4 black balloons and 1 white balloon. They led me into the tent, which unsurprisingly was illuminated by multiple fairy lights draped across the roof. There was a strong smell of burning sage and lavender incense, and the floor was covered in hay that crunched whenever someone took a step. I had assumed that Madame Arachnia would be an old lady covered in warts. I turned out to be very wrong. When she pulled down her shawl, she revealed a stunningly beautiful woman with a pale, freckled face, bright yellow eyes, and a tattoo of a black widow spider around her right eye. The sides of her head were shaved, with the jet black hair on top done into a quiff, with a white streak dyed into it. On each of her fingers, she wore a golden covering coated with encrusted gems, and she had the letters H and P tattooed on the backs of her left and right hands, respectively. "Samuel, I'm guessing," she said, while pulling off her shawl as I approached. Her amber eyes stared directly into mine, as if she was trying to peer into my soul. "That's me, though most people call me Sam," I responded, while pulling out the wicker chair from under the table so that I could take a seat. "Well, Sam, I understand your dear Elaine has been attacked by a horrible disease," she replied as she picked a small black satin sack off the floor and placed it on the table, its glass contents rattling around inside as she did. "Yep, stomach cancer. We tried everything that we could afford, but nothing's worked, and I don't know how long she has left," I explained while biting my lip. I found it hard to discuss these matters with anyone, without bursting into tears. Madam sat in silence with her fingers crossed for a few seconds to allow me to regain my composure. Once I did, she continued, "Cancer is a horrible thing. To me, it is the greatest evil in our universe. It turns our body against us and kills us slowly from the inside, a truly reprehensible disease. People beg their God to cure them, but more often than not, neither their God nor their doctor can do anything for them," she replied as she put her hand into the sack and began to rummage around inside. "However, the old ones would never allow a servant to die such a horrible death. After rummaging around for a bit, she eventually pulled out a glass vial with a cardboard cork at the top. The vial was full of a crimson substance that swirled around in the glass. Madame Arachnia placed the vial into my hand. Then with her hand, she closed mine over the vial. She held my hand in between both of hers and looked me in the eye again. "I made this concoction especially for your Elaine. She should drink this as soon as possible and then rest. It'll clear her of all ailments and strengthen her stomach in no time." I'm not sure if it was her confidence or my desire to want her to be correct, or maybe a mix of both, but at that moment, I completely believed Madame Arachnia. This was going to work. "Thank you so much. What do I owe you?" I asked her as I pulled an envelope out of my jacket, which contained $3,000, my entire savings. "Oh, monetary gain means little to me. Elaine's return to health will be of use to my gods. Appeasing them means much more to me than any piece of paper assigned an arbitrary value," Madame Arachnia replied as she lifted her hand up and gestured for me to put the money away. There had been many red flags from my trip to the camp, but this should have been the biggest. Nobody does anything for free, whether they take money or not. In some way, they expect to be rewarded for what they've done. At the time, however, I didn't think about that. I just thought Madame was some sort of saint, doing good deeds in the name of some misplaced belief in fictional gods. How wrong I turned out to be. The first 4 days after Elaine had taken the potion were no different than usual, and I started to believe we had fallen for a stupid hoax. I was angry at myself for falling for such an obviously fake cure. I was even angrier for having put Elaine through more stress, getting her hopes up again for nothing. On the 5th day, though, things changed for the better. Elaine woke up and seemed to be doing much better. The color had come back to her face, and she was full of energy. Her beautiful smile touched each of her rosy red cheeks in the morning when she woke me up to tell me how amazing she felt. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw how great she looked. If it weren't for the weight loss, you wouldn't have believed that she was a cancer patient. However, the good feelings didn't last, as she immediately vomited when she ate some toast that I had made for her. We were both shocked when she threw up, and I could tell how much effort Elaine was putting in to stop herself from exploding into tears. It had seemed that we found a cure, but after she threw up, it became apparent it had only been a placebo. Except, it wasn't. We decided to go to the hospital for a checkup, hoping that the potion may have fought back some of the cancer. Not enough to return Elaine's appetite, but enough to give her back some energy and to give us a fighting chance. However, when the test results came back, the doctors were dumbfounded. The cancer was completely gone. There was no trace of it at all. Her physicians couldn't believe their eyes. Elaine sat in silent shock upon hearing the news, only coming out of it when I threw my arms over her. "I'm alive," she said, before beginning to cry as I held her tight in my arms. The doctors informed us that Elaine throwing up while eating was most likely just her body getting used to regular food again, and that things would soon return to normal. They told us to ensure that she only ate small portions and soup for the time being, which is all she could usually stomach when she was sick. However, over the next few days, she couldn't even stomach that. 4 days had passed since she got the all clear, and she couldn't even eat some toast and soup. The rest of her body had been cured, but it seemed like her stomach had deteriorated. I decided I needed to meet with Madame Arachnia again. If anyone had answers, it was her. I just wished the answers I received had been different. When I reached the camp, I was once again greeted by the creepy jesters who walked me into Madame's tent. I explained to her that the potion had worked, but that Elaine couldn't eat no matter what we tried. Her response to this took my own appetite away from me. "Well, of course she can't eat. You aren't feeding her the right meat," she said as she placed some tarot cards face down on the table, keeping her eyes focused on them as she spoke to me. "Well, you never told me that there was food she couldn't eat. What can she eat?" I replied, expecting to get an answer like horse or rat. However, the answer was much, much worse. "Humans," she replied as she lifted her head to finally look at me and grin. My heart sank into my stomach upon hearing this, and I began to sweat profusely before lashing out in anger. "Don't joke with me!" I screamed as I jumped up from my seat and pounded a closed fist against the table, causing the tarot cards to fly off and flutter to the floor. Both of the jesters took a step forward, preparing to attack me, but Madam ordered them to step back before beckoning for me to retake my seat. "Sit down and relax, Sam. I am not joking. My potions aren't a miracle. They cure, but they need something in return. In this case, Elaine's stomach has been modified to fight off all infections and diseases, but in return, she can only eat her fellow humans," she explained as she reached her right hand out and called for one of the jesters, who then carried over a lunchbox and placed it on the table, opening it up to reveal a liver. "This is a human liver. Take it home and cook it for about 6 minutes on each side, then serve it. It'll be the tastiest meal Elaine has ever had, and once she's had the taste for human meat, she'll never want to go back. Not that she has a choice," Arachnia said before starting to chuckle as she placed the top back on the box and slid it across the table to me. The anger I had felt before quadrupled as I sat there being mocked. However, I took a few deep breaths and composed myself, knowing that Madam's 2 goons might not be held back by her a second time if I lost it again. "And how do I know this is a human liver? This could easily just be a liver from one of your animals. I want you to stop playing around with me and give me a proper answer. Stop this frustrating joke, please," I calmly replied as I sat back in my chair and crossed my arms. Madam didn't immediately respond. Instead, she turned her head to look at the jester to the left of her and nodded to him. Once she did, he walked away to the back of the tent, coming back a moment later with a plastic bag slung over his shoulder. He walked up to the table and dropped the bag directly onto it. The full weight of the bag hit the tabletop with a loud thud before a head rolled out from it. A human head. Once the head rolled out, I leaped from my seat and screamed before the jester put both hands on my shoulders and forced me back down into the chair, hoarsely ordering me to sit now. "We don't do jokes around here, Samuel. If I say something, I mean it," Madam Arachnia said with a serious tone, though I was no longer looking at her. My eyes were transfixed on the detached head sitting on the table in front of me. The head looked to have belonged to an older man in either his 40s or 50s, judging from his wrinkled face, long gray hair, and the bald spots dispersed throughout. His facial expression was one of immense pain, and his eyes had been gouged out. I started to wonder what this man had done to earn such a fate, but that mattered little to me. What did matter, however, was how dangerous Madame Arachnia was. My right leg twitched uncontrollably underneath the table as she spoke, fearing that I may face the same fate as this man. "Now, take that lunchbox, leave this camp, and never dare return. The boys will see you out," Madame Arachnia said as the jesters approached me and lifted me out of the chair. One of them handed me the lunchbox before both walked me out of the camp and back to civilization. When I got home, I cooked the liver just as Madame had told me to, and just as she predicted, Elaine loved it. But more importantly, she was able to keep it down. I waited until the next day to see if she was able to keep it all down, before sitting her down and explaining to her that she had consumed a man's liver. At first, she thought it was a joke, but once I assured her it wasn't, she understandably slapped me across the face and stormed off, leaving me alone with a deep red hand-shaped mark on my face. She didn't return until later that night, but when she did, she was much calmer than when she left. It was that night that we accepted we only had 2 choices going forward. We could either do what needed to be done, or allow Elaine to starve. The latter was never an option, and there was no plan B, so it was obvious that we would need to kill to keep Elaine alive. I said that I would do it, as I had gotten us into this mess. We are, or should I say were, both pretty non-violent people, so jumping straight into murdering people wasn't easy. We knew we couldn't just kill anyone, and so Elaine decided that we would choose certain people who deserved to die. So, that explains why I'm sitting in a parking lot across from a 24-hour gym at 1 a.m., waiting for the right person to leave. The right person was Jack Werther, a 33-year-old fitness aficionado. He needed to keep himself in top shape to impress the ladies, but when I say ladies, I should really say girls. Young girls. Jack usually likes them between 13 and 16, and he was into some pretty weird stuff. I know this because Jack has been texting back and forth with Elaine for the last 3 weeks. He's been led to believe that she's a 14-year-old girl. I've done this a few times now, so you might assume I was getting used to it. But if I'm being honest, I dread doing this every time. I struggle to sleep for days once I notice that meat is running low. Thankfully, I don't have to do this too often. A whole human lasts quite a while, but not as long as you'd expect, since it's all Elaine can eat. Most of the body can be used, bar the head, hands, and feet, which she struggles to eat. She especially enjoys the eyes, which she blends up like a smoothie. I wish Elaine would have picked a weaker, less fitness-loving meal, but we take what we can get. And besides, it's hard to survive multiple shots to the head from a hammer, no matter how strong and fit you are. I had to sit and wait for Jack for over 2 hours. During that time, my usual feelings of fear, anxiousness, and paranoia subsided as I tried to focus on staying awake. However, Jack eventually left the gym and briskly walked up the quiet, empty street and into the darkness. Once I saw him leave, I grabbed the hammer out of my bag and followed after him. Time for dinner.
You've just heard My Girlfriend is a Cannibal, written by Andy Leavy and performed by Mylo Reid. A grisly love story if ever there was one, reminding us that devotion and survival can blur into horror when the price is blood. Mylo brought raw emotion to a tale of desperate choices and the nightmare that follows when you feed love with flesh. And with that, we bring to a close our Evil Idol Resurrection series. 5 weeks of haunting voices and unforgettable performances from the past, capped tonight with 2 tales of dark cures. But don't forget, the competition is alive and well right now in 2025. Round 1 is underway, and Round 2 begins in November. Make your voice heard, literally. Watch, vote, and help us discover the next great talent in horror storytelling. That concludes tonight's episode of Chilling Tales for Dark Nights. Don't forget, subscribe to our YouTube channel, give a thumbs up to your favorite Evil Idol contestants, and help us decide who will rise victorious this year. Follow us on Spotify and leave us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It's one of the best ways you can support what we do. And if you like ad-free listening, early access, and exclusive content, head to chillingtalesfordarknights.com and sign up as a member today. Memberships are just $7.99 a month with discounts on an annual plan. Join us on Facebook, Instagram, X, and TikTok to stay connected with our community of horror fans. Tonight's episode marked the 5th and final entry in our Evil Idol Resurrection series, celebrating standout performances from past years. But rest assured, the chills will keep coming. Until next time, turn off the lights and turn on the dark. Sweet dreams, listeners. Sweet dreams.
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.